Hello, this is a homily for the 28th Sunday of the year, and it handles a rather touchy topic because we don't like to think about this, and that question is, how do we look to God? How does He see us? And the readings are rough. They are kind of real challenges to us. The first reading is taken from the second book of Kings, and you have Elisha meeting Naaman the Syrian. Obviously, previous to this piece of the reading, Elisha has healed Naaman from his leprosy, and we're not sure if it was Hansen's disease, or the technical name for leprosy today, but it certainly was some extremely serious complaint that made his life miserable and his work miserable as well. And so what he has done is he's been healed. He tries to offer a gift, which Elisha doesn't accept, because Elisha is essentially just doing what he was put on earth to do, basically being God's man in the house of Israel. And he's a tiny little simile for what you will find in Jesus Christ, fulfilled and complete. Here you have Naaman saying, going through his conversion experience now I know that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. So he has discovered, instead of all the metal gods and the wooden gods and the stone gods, who are just bits of wood, bits of stone, and bits of metal, he's discovered a God who actually is God, who actually has power. And so he says, if you will not accept the gift, please let me have 2 mule loads of earth, for I will no longer offer holocaust or sacrifice to any other God except to the Lord. What he means there is that he's realized, okay, Israel has the real God. My people don't, and so I'm going to now follow the Jewish custom of worshiping on Jewish soil. But of course he's got to travel, and so he'll simply take the Israel's soil of Israel with him, and have become a mobile Jew, as there were many in the world at that time. But he's kind of realized that there is an attachment to the Holy Land. We still call it the Holy Land for a good reason. It's literally the gospel put into concrete, stone, water, trees, rivers, brooks, the whole deal, to show us, yes, God has a very clear connection with this earth. That's going to come up again in Jesus' life, where God is going to have a very close connection to all of humanity because he becomes incarnate as a human being. All stories for another time. Back to second book of Kings. Naaman's had his conversion. He has previously looked to everyone as a leper. He looked like a leper. And now he's been converted. He has flesh like the flesh of a little child. All of these symbols are going to continue in the Psalms, Psalm 98. The Lord has revealed to the nations his saving power. And then the psalm uses the word, the Lord has made his salvation known. Salvation, interestingly enough, comes from the Latin word for healing, and consequently the Lord has healed his people. And the whole point here is that when we stand before God, we really do need healing. No arrogance, pride on our part is going to conceal this fact that we need to be healed, and we need to be healed by the only God who can do it, the God of Israel. And so the second reading then fits in beautifully here from 2 Timothy And what you have here is Jesus explaining, Paul explaining to Timothy, if we have died with him, we shall also live with him. So the whole register, if you want to use a technical term, has shifted from the Old Testament to the New Testament, in that where you just had an image of Christ in Elisha in the Old Testament, here you have Paul talking about Christ himself. And in Christ we will live, provided we die with him. And that means to follow him absolutely. If we persevere, in other words, stick to this faithful commitment all the way through life, we shall also reign with him. But there's a downside. If we deny him, he will deny us. Because God is absolutely faithful and he sticks to what he has said. Paul is very aware of that. Then we move to the gospel. Let me add one more point from the second reading. We have essentially Paul explaining that with the coming of Jesus, we have God moving from images of physical health to images of spiritual health, because in fact we are healed internally as well. Now, whether we're healed physically can really depend on what God needs us for after this. But spiritually, he will heal anyone who is faithful to him. That's the shift that happens in the New Testament in Christ. Speaking of Christ, we now go to the gospel, and we have this piece from Luke 17, where we have Jesus meeting the 10 lepers as he was entering the village. In other words, they weren't in the village. They were outside because they would have had to stay outside. There was a real set of prescriptions about who could be where, simply so that contagion was not passed on. And of course, people weren't sure how leprosy was passed on, so outside the village with you. And they, if they were outside the village, wouldn't have been able to go to the synagogue. They would not have been able to go up to the temple. They would literally have been cut off from most of society. Quite often somebody would help them with food, but it would be a case of placing food outside the village and leaving it to them. So they beg for healing, and Jesus simply says, go show yourselves to the priests. As they were going, they were cleansed. In other words, they had enough faith in him to at least do the one action that he wanted. Go and show yourselves to the priests. Because it was the priests who actually said whether a person was clean or unclean. And if you were clean, that meant you could participate in worship. You could also participate in all the social life. If you were unclean, you could not, because literally you were a sinner, and you had to make a recompense. Jesus has healed these men, and basically you have, actually we don't know that they were men, but he has healed them, and they go their way. One of them returns glorifying God in a loud voice. This is really the reason why healing happens, so that we are glorified, we can glorify God. The point being that Jesus is the agent of healing, not only physically, but also spiritually. And as long as we don't over-spiritualize religion, that just moving into quietism and all that kind of stuff, basically we learn that it is Jesus who heals us. And Jesus who, on occasion, will heal us physically if that's what he needs for his mission in the world today. But this means that how do we look before God? We look like lepers. And we have to be healed and literally healed again and again and again, because we do sin again and again and again. As unpleasant as that is to accept, and why the modern world doesn't have any idea of what sin is. Everything is psychological, which is very rarely the case. Quite often it is people choosing to sin because they want to, and look like lepers as a result. Thank you.